Hello, folks, and I'm Will Larson, and I am grateful that Julia went first, so I get to have a slightly easier intro into this one. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about designing good process and really why a good process is evolved rather than designed. I work at Stripe, working with kind of foundation, which is data engineering, infrastructure engineering, and developer productivity. And what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about a story of designing a process that I did about a year ago, kind of dear to my heart, and then some learnings from the process. So like any good story, it starts with the villain. Unfortunately, in this case, the villain, as is often the case as you kind of get further in your career, is actually me. And so this is a conversation I had about a year ago working with a senior engineer. And he was asking how we had selected someone to run like a really critical project. You know, the sort of project where there's a couple of them each quarter, each year that you might get to staff level, might kind of get a lot of visibility to the company, really important kind of everyone that you're working with. And he just stopped and said, like, how did we select the person who ended up running this? And I just kind of paused, and I was thinking, like, how did I actually select the person who ran this project? And I kept pausing until it got awkward because my answer was just terrible. But as I thought about it, no artists were harmed in any of these slides, rest assured. As I thought about it, the way we had actually selected the person to run this project is a pretty routine way to select something, which is we had a few people who did all of the projects at this shape. And then when we had something was pretty time sensitive, really needed the next person to work on it, I just went back to the person who had always done this sort of project. It was important, needed to get it done, he could help. But what this was doing is that it meant that we had all these new people in the organization who wanted to work on these projects as well, who had never had the opportunity to learn kind of to work on these new types of projects, who were kind of feeling like they had got no opportunity. But also the people who were doing all the same projects over and over were getting bored, and we weren't growing our organization. And from this, we kind of developed a bit of a problem statement, like understanding what is it that we really wanted to solve. And what we decided after chatting through it a little bit is we really wanted to make sure that everyone has access to apply to lead important projects. And then before you start any process, and what we did here is you have to pause and make sure you should actually work on a process. Designing process is incredibly time consuming, so I think a lot of times people go from a problem statement directly into kind of solving. And so we paused, was this actually a good time for us to work on this? And we decided after some reflection that this was something to work on. When we think about inclusion, we think a lot about kind of access to membership in the team and also access to opportunity. And so this, for us, we decided could be a core part of how we think about getting access to opportunity, was having a more structured way in terms of finding how people got access to these most important kind of staff level projects. And so when we decided to get started, we did not take a lot of time to design a solution. We actually took about half an hour to jot down the first approach, which I think is incredibly important. But we basically just took the problem statement, and for each of these poorly highlighted words, we selected a simple strategy. So folks should have access to something means they have to know that it's going to happen. So let's send out an email to some sort of defined email list. To apply, they should be able to have some structured process to let people know they're interested in something. And then this really should only apply to important projects. It's not like every project. We don't want to add a ton of overhead. Just really want to make sure that for the most important kind of staff level projects, there's some structure there. And there's a couple reasons why we try to go as quickly as possible when we do this in terms of the first design phase. And one of them is that as you work more and more on a process, you get increasingly attached to it. I'm sure many of you have spent a week or 2 weeks designing this great process. Get so attached to it that when you kind of tell someone about it, they're like, yeah, this won't work. But you can't hear it anymore because you've already spent so much time loving the process and making it perfect, solving for all the constraints you know about, and not kind of able to hear other people's by the time you actually start rolling it out. So this is why the really quick design phase is so valuable. And for this one, we literally spent half an hour just designing very quickly together what's a simple approach. The other issue is there's so many known unknowns. I think whenever you're designing a new process, it's because something that used to be true is no longer true. And I think that's the case if you're staying at your current company, something's no longer working, maybe your calibrations are too toilsome, maybe the way you're picking folks for promotions isn't working, maybe the way you're doing kind of selecting team changes for folks isn't working. But whenever you design a new process, there's something that isn't working anymore. And in this case, we were just picking the same people over and over and over, really wanting to make sure that we found a way to change that. This is also true when you switch companies, right? It's so often when people come into a new company, they're like, like this company is like, doesn't really know what they're doing. I'll just like kind of cargo cult forward, like worked at my previous company. But there's so many things you don't know at a new company that really just slowing down, learning for a little bit, incredibly valuable. So, okay, now that we know why we shouldn't kind of design the full one, now that we know that we should kind of try like a little bit more thoughtful, kind of incremental stage approach to design, let's talk about how we actually did it. This is our approach. It's pretty simple, but it works, and that's like kind of one of the worst lessons of management, is that most of the things that work are like very simple. You just have to like keep applying them in a systematic way. So we worked on the problem statement. Then you think about like how could we solve that? Then you test it with the team, and then if it works well with the team, you like expand like to another team. If it doesn't work well, you go back to the problem statement approach test. This is exactly how you would design any single product you ever worked on. This is exactly how you would solve any technical problem you ever worked on. And yet so often when we work on designing process, we like don't use any of these things that we've mastered, any of these skills and these competencies, kind of think like we'll just like write it once, finish it, and then move forward. Just doing the same exact thing. And expanding is so important because when you're only working with one team, the iteration loop, the test loop is so cheap. You can get people who are really excited about it. And so starting out with one team is really passionate about it. In this case, the engineer who was kind of concerned about the problem to begin with, working with his team, they were really motivated to be part of it. Then we found another team, and then eventually over time, we rolled it out to the entire organization. I think this idea of like selecting one team, then expanding incrementally and slowly is the most important thing to do. The most important single lesson as you want to work with a larger and larger engineering organization is testing, getting it small and right, then expanding. If you start rolling out really large changes, it can get pretty painful. So I want to talk about like 4 different ways as we rolled this out that we actually ran into resistance and how, because we were doing it with such a small initial group, that we're able to evolve it. The first one is like, there's a certain type of person who, when I was younger, who like when you ask them to take on a huge project, they just like think briefly and they're like, yes, like I can do that. And then there's other people who really take a totally different approach to making these decisions. They think about it, then they talk to their peers, they talk to their manager, they talk to kind of maybe mentors outside of the company. And if you think about our goal, kind of how do we increase access to these critical opportunities across the entire engineering organization, the folks who have the most methodical kind of approach to this tend to be the folks who are punished and have the highest kind of penalty for failure. And these were really the folks who wanted to get involved and that didn't have access to begin with. So as we thought about this, we got much more structured in terms of making sure we had at least 1 week, but often 2 weeks for people to apply, and that gave them the opportunity to really validate whether it was something that made sense for them, or if it was something that maybe this was not the right opportunity for them. Then, go back to the problem statement, solve, test it again. The next thing we did is as we rolled out this process, we didn't necessarily pick the right team to start with. We picked a team that really loved the idea, was willing to kind of deal with some overhead, but really making sure that we pick the right cohorts over time, where just because it works for one team who's like really passionate about kind of more structure doesn't mean it'll work for other teams. I know you've probably all worked at a company where everyone uses Agile or sprints, and there's like one team holding out in the corner who like refuses to like open Jira or something. And there are like just teams that just kind of like don't enjoy different types of process. So making sure you have like different cohorts. Again, like if there's a theme, this is exactly how you do product management, right? This is exactly how you design and test a rollout of a product. So just be thoughtful about picking different types of groups, different needs, different offices, different cultures, different remote mix, maybe folks with like really heavy family obligations who might not have the same like ability to kind of change their schedules, et cetera, depending on the process that you're working on. And for us, this was just selecting a couple of different teams to test with as we rolled it out on the way to getting to all of the engineering. Another issue that we ran into like pretty immediately is like part of asking folks to sign up for a really large project is them implicitly scoping the level of effort. And it turns out people are also like wildly inconsistent about doing this, right? If you've ever worked on like a well-known company, then you have the experience of someone on like a Hacker News saying like, I could literally do this over a weekend. It turns out there's like a very large contingent of people who think any problem can be solved over a weekend. And it's not necessarily like a good way for them to be estimating like the level of effort for a project. It's more like a self-assessment than like a project assessment, if you will. And so we really ran into people just like having wildly divergent expectations about how much effort this project or any project would take. And so we actually got much more specific about our guess. It's not that we can actually estimate software. Like, no one can estimate software complexity or software projects. But at least it's the same person estimating with the same bias and the same kind of general like skew to estimations. At least we got some consistency that way. The other and kind of last thing we realized is that it turns out like it's really hard to get people to volunteer for terrible projects. And it's sort of like one of our initial assumptions was like we would just like send out these like emails asking for people to do things and they would like immediately jump in. And it turns out there's like large categories of projects where this is just totally not true. Some of them are actually projects I think are exciting, but like just the engineers like were in no way excited to participate in. Often things like heavier kind of program or project management components. And so what we did is we actually added another step. Kind of like the silence was deafening for a couple of these. So now if we don't get any replies, any volunteers in the first kind of half, we go out and start nudging people. We put together a list of everyone we want to apply, and we go out and like get them, their manager or me or just someone involved to go kind of ask them to consider volunteering. And this works surprisingly well. When people are kind of asked, it's a vote of confidence that you believe that they're going to be able to be successful. And so this was something that worked really well. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. Like doing good process is hard. And that's one of the reasons that like we often don't do good process. But in this case, just adding an explicit nudge step in how we actually ran this works surprisingly well. So as we kind of step back, we had this idea, came from a conversation. We did like a very simple, like terrible implementation over 30 minutes just writing the idea. And then we just tested it, we tested it, we tested it, we tested it. And we finally kind of over the course of 3 or 4 months got to a place of a process that we're able to roll out to all of engineering. And it rolled out quite well and is now kind of consistently used for these larger projects at Stripe. That's been something that was incredibly rewarding to see happen, because I think initially I was very skeptical this would work. It's like pretty high overhead, not obviously super valuable, but by testing it, we really learned that it was useful, it was applicable, and we could roll it out. And so a couple of just general observations, some learnings as we jump away from the story. The first is a clear problem statement. If you find a process that's not working, it's almost always because the people designing it actually were trying to solve different problems and just never acknowledged it to each other. I once designed an architecture group, and I wanted to use it to give advice, and someone else wanted to use it to be like a prestige way to recognize them. And it turned out the thing we designed like, didn't actually make sense for any purpose, and pretty quickly kind of fell apart. Just like explicitly, like honestly answering like what the problem statement is, the first important step to any process. Then refining it is also important, but just stating it is really critical. The second is evolving, not designing. I think going in attached to a solution just doesn't work. You end up, you don't know very much because you're just getting started. Like your users, in this case, like the engineers, the managers you're working with, your peers, like haven't given you what the information they have yet. And if you like use all your energy, if you use all your time trying to get it right up front, then you just don't have time to listen and incorporate your reality. You end up with these like known bad processes from the very beginning. The other thing, by rolling out slowly, you get to spend all your energy, all your time learning from what's not working and making it better. If you roll out a process prematurely, you spend all your time enforcing the process, telling people they need to follow it, arguing with people who aren't following it, they're getting upset that people don't like understand your vision of the process. I've spent a lot of time doing this, I know. But you can instead roll it out slowly and spend your energy making it better. It's just a much more pleasant way to live. If you ever launched a product that no one wants, which I've definitely done, kind of know this, like you roll it out, you're waiting, and just no one picks it up. A good process people organically adopt because it actually solves real problems for them well. And the way you get to great process is by learning, evolving, not by kind of trying to force things through mandate and authority. Considering cohorts, there's just so many different types of teams with different needs. I think for like ladders and rubrics, like one of the most obvious ones is kind of front-end engineers and then infrastructure engineers. Having a single like ladder to evaluate them for promotion for levels almost never represents them kind of equitably. But there's like all these different ways that things work. Kind of infrastructure engineers might working on longer time frames, or if you have a planning process that has like weekly sprints, that might not have anything to say most of the time. just really thinking about how the different teams will have different like needs and properties. And a lot of them like aren't intuitive to you, particularly if you're not a parent, like kind of, or you don't have significant like time constraints from family. You might just like not think about how kind of moving meetings or shifting different pieces will have so much impact on your peers and your colleagues that do. You don't know everything, and that's why it's so important to kind of test these cohorts. And thank you all, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Round of applause. Thank you.